So how's your social isolation? I'm finding that the reality of it is sinking in more and more these days. As we cut contacts, up until a little while ago, there were some other kids that we would let Noah play with, but now he's not having any contact with anybody outside the home. He's getting a little bit cranky. We're getting a little bit cranky as well too. Even our walks are becoming more infrequent. Like even just walking around the neighborhood somehow doesn't always feel right, like it's something that we should be doing. Certainly, we're not able to go hang around in parks the way that we are accustomed to. There's a limit to what television can offer. Netflix is good for an hour or two, right? But that gets old. And the last few days really have been too cool to be in the backyard. It's not exactly hammock weather or even really trampolining weather. And I've been finding, curiously, that telephone is getting harder. I'm not a telephone person, and aside from a brief period when I was in teenage years, when you get infatuations, you can speak to your beloved on the telephone for hours. Once I passed through that, I found I don't really like the telephone. To me, that disembodied voice at the other end, when you can't see their face, you can't see their body language. To me, the telephone is not real communication. It's a very weak substitute. And normally I use the telephone really just to set up meetings, to have real conversations. So I'll say, I'll be over at 10. But I don't chat on the telephone. But I'm finding that more and more these days, that's the only way to really keep in contact and keep ministry going. So that's a bit of a learning curve that I'm going through. So if I call you up and I'm weirdly distant, it's not you, it's me. But anyway, as this being alone, and I have to say right off the bat that first of all, I have the luxury of being alone together. So I do have Noah at home. I've got Kyungsu at home. So in that sense, I'm very blessed. But the reality of trying to keep a child entertained and try and continue some sort of education and, you know, continuing to keep meals on the table, that's it's becoming rough. And there's a lot of waiting. And I think all of us are waiting for the restrictions to be lifted so that we can return to normal life. But whatever it is that we define as normal life. But as I think about this, there are two types of waiting. So there's the waiting which I certainly seem to be engaged in right now, and I think a lot of other people that is a waiting without anticipation. So waiting for a hardship to pass, essentially, just trying to endure the present constriction of life, as opposed to the waiting that we do, say, when we're 6 years old and it's only 3 days before Christmas. And that's another entirely different kind of waiting because we're waiting with joy and we're so excited. And I'm wondering how to turn one into the other because I think many of us are doing that dreadful waiting of just enduring and trying to get to the end, when in fact we could be anticipating. And certainly the anticipation waiting, there's a lot more thrill to it. There's a joy to it. There's something wonderful about it, even as it seems to just tear us apart inside. So I wonder how we do that. And I was thinking about waiting in the Bible. Certainly, Paul writes about it in Romans. He says, "I consider that the sufferings of this present time aren't worth comparing to the glory that will soon be revealed." And that's encouraging, but it's still a little bit abstract. It doesn't necessarily tell us what we're waiting for. But there's another story that actually happens around the same time of year, and we find it in the first couple of chapters of Acts. Now, of course, this is immediately following Easter when Jesus has been crucified, he's risen, and then he's ascended again. He's gone away. And he makes a promise. He says to the disciples, "Don't leave Jerusalem until the Father sends you the gift that he promised, the gift I told you about before. And I told you that John baptized with water, but that you're going to be baptized with the Holy Spirit. So this was the gift that they were waiting for. So then the apostles returned from the Mount of Olives into Jerusalem. And when they arrived, they went into the upstairs room of the house where they had been staying. And there they waited. Now, I don't think they quite understood what it was that they were waiting for exactly either. They knew that it was the Holy Spirit, that it was the counselor. I'm not sure that they understood what that would be. So they're waiting. I don't know whether they would be waiting that endurance type waiting or whether it was an anticipation kind of waiting. But it strikes me that we're really doing much the same thing, and we're doing it really at the same time of year, so early spring. And here we are all huddled together in our upper rooms, and we're waiting. Now, of course, the disciples, they didn't have a disease waiting for them outside. What they had was possibly worse. They had Roman soldiers and other collaborators who would certainly be willing to point the finger and associate the disciples and say, hey, those are the guys who are hanging out with that criminal that you executed just a little while ago. So they were hiding inside it, and they hid for 50 days. Now, for most of us, we're working on like maybe 15 days. Most of us really only about 2 weeks, and maybe not even that long that we've been really socially isolated. I mean, we've been away from large groups. But as far as, these more intense rules about, 5 people or less, that's much more recent. So we haven't made it yet the 40 days that they have. But what do you suppose they did while they were waiting? And it occurs to me that as they were waiting, they were likely bolstering one another, sharing stories of the exciting times that they had had with Jesus, speculating about maybe what it might be that is coming. And certainly we have the advantage of being 2,000 years later and reading what happened when the Holy Spirit did come. And all of a sudden, these people who were afraid and hiding out, they were bold, they were proclaiming, they were just right out there on the street preaching about Jesus. And thousands of people were drawn to them and added to their number. And it was a remarkable thing. And I think for us, if we wait with anticipation and we instead move from this feeling of dread, of hiding out from a disease, and instead we focus more on the anticipation of how wonderful it's going to be to hug those people that we haven't seen, how wonderful it's going to be to keep them up to date on all the things that have been happening, how wonderful it's going to be to share the stories of how God has been moving within us as we've waited and as we've been silent. I think if we have more of this attitude of anticipation, that makes the waiting, it's much more bearable in a different sense. So instead of dread and endurance, we're sitting on the edge of our seat and we're looking out the window at the people, that we see walking by and the squirrels and thinking how great it's going to be when we're finally a part of that once again. And I'm certainly looking forward to that. So I'd like to leave you with a few words from Psalm 130. I wait for the Lord. My soul waits, and in his word I hope. My soul waits for the Lord more than watchmen for the morning, more than watchmen for the morning.